54321 and Q.
Good evening.
Broadcasting Scotland's news.
Mary Marcus, the Joan Collins of BBC Scotland.
From the rooftops.
But you find that when you go to people's houses, they accept you just as if you were a man.
To the streets.
Is this a television camera?
4, take 5.
And across the world.
Good evening from Arlington Cemetery.
Reported Scotland. 50 years of BBC TV News. Sunday at 6 on BBC One Scotland.
BBC Scotland broadcast its first Scottish news programme in 1957.
Here is the Scottish News Summary.
It might only have lasted 5 minutes, but it marked a major turning point in the BBC's attitude to broadcasting in Scotland.
20 seconds to go.
This is the story
15 seconds to go.
of 50 years of news and the transformation of Reporting Scotland from light news magazine to lean, mean news machine.
54321 and Q.
What do you think of television coming to these parts, Mrs. McIntyre?
Well, I think it'll be super, you know.
Will it help liven your evening? Oh, yes.
If you will tell me I'm the only...
What programmes are you looking forward to hearing most? The news?
Hello again, shaboom, and hoping we'll meet again. Oh, life could be a dream.
Of course, when television started in Scotland, there wasn't a Scottish television news service, but it was both inevitable and, in fact, essential that as the service developed, there had to be a Scottish television BBC output for news.
The BBC first began broadcasting in Scotland in 1952, but it was the arrival of independent television in 1955 that was the real catalyst for a newsroom north of the border.
In the BBC, you were encouraged to call it commercial television, not independent, but it was independent television. And eventually the BBC in Scotland realised that Scottish television was about to start and there would be a competitor.
3 years later, BBC Scotland had a studio dedicated to news programmes and was ready to broadcast by August 1957, just pipping STV to the post, a fact they were very happy to bring to the viewer's attention.
These Scottish news summaries will be broadcast 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. The time will be 6:05, and the first of them will be 2 weeks from tonight. That's Friday, August the 30th.
There were about 10 people, I would have said, on the editorial side in a very tiny office on the 3rd floor of Broadcasting House. Very, very cramped, but that's how it was. It was small beginnings.
At Stevens Shipyard in Linthouse, Glasgow, the 3rd biggest shipyard in the Clyde, engineers have been warned that a number of them will have to be paid off.
To begin with, we only had a 5-minute bulletin. And in that 5-minute bulletin, there was hardly any illustration. And it was more or less a radio bulletin transferred to the screen.
A pair of ospreys have recently hatched eggs in Speyside.
And we have a picture here of a pair of ospreys at their eyrie in Sweden. Yes.
Pictures were in high demand and could only be done by mute film cameras that went and filmed whatever the major story was, and then a commentary had to be done by the news observer, not the news reporter.
Between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening, somebody saw smoke coming from a big warehouse near the banks of the Clyde. The warehouse was a store for whiskey, which is very inflammable stuff. The fire brigade was sent for, and when they arrived, the firemen started to investigate. Suddenly, and without any warning, the warehouse exploded in their faces, burst wide open, and tons of masonry came crashing down on the men and the fire engine in the street below.
These people were wordsmiths rather than reporters as you would know them now, and so it worked. They painted a picture of what happened, and sometimes this could be very, very effective.
And on top of the flames was a great cloud of hot embers, like a crimson snowstorm, twisting and turning and towering into the air.
Much of the film was shot outside Glasgow and other parts of Scotland. It had to come to Glasgow by car or train.
Every day, the race to get the film shot and back to Glasgow was on. But the journey didn't end there. It had to be delivered to the lab to be processed in a chemical bath and edited and scripted, and all this had to be done before the deadline of 4 p.m, so it could get back to the BBC in time for broadcast.
Geographically, Scotland is a large country. We tried to get as much picture coverage as we could in the news, but it's a long way, for instance, to go to the Orkneys to cover some kind of festival. And certainly getting the film back from the Orkneys, getting it processed, could take days. It was realised that the thing to do was to gather all these things, to cover all these events throughout Scotland, be it in Caithness or down in the borders, and put it together in a magazine programme.
These days, there's bound to be a story with a twist, and in this case, it was to set up a twisting record in Aberdeen. From midday on Wednesday, 12 youngsters hope to twist for 33 hours. Who says young people today lack stamina?
The 5-minute bulletin was combined with the magazine and was eventually renamed A Quick Look Round. The chosen presenters had a theatrical training and soon added a certain something to the proceedings.
'Cause you've got personality, walk with personality, talk with personality, smile with personality, charm with personality, love with personality, and plus you got a great big heart.
A lot of people think in retrospect that all I ever did was sit in the studio and read words probably written by somebody else, which was totally not the case.
This is Kelty in Fife, and I don't usually view the countryside from such an angle, but it was only by coming up here that I was able to meet someone who has this view, or something very like it, every working day.
We were often sent out to do quite outre things, and on one occasion I had to interview a woman chimney sweep on the top of a building covered with frost in the middle of winter, which was fairly hazardous and made more so by the fact that I was expecting a baby in about 2 months' time.
Now, Mrs. Bell, do you find that when you go to people's houses to sweep their chimneys that they accept you just as if you were a man, or do they feel a bit dubious about it?
Some people do accept me, others don't, but my husband's always with me, so they seem to think that's all right.
That's a help.
Yes.
It was just a news magazine, and we did everything and everybody, you know. Everyone who had the misfortune to cross the path of BBC Scotland was wheeled in to be interviewed.
One thing I must ask you, Mr. Macaulay, is how on earth do you pick up a lobster without getting a nasty nip? I see you at the water, Mr. Leslie. Hello, Hugh.
Well, I didn't really believe in fairies when I came to the Red Elf Cave, and now that I've been here, I must say I'm not particularly convinced. The only thing I am sure about are the beautiful scenery and the midges.
Mary Marcos was not the only star of A Quick Look Round. Jimison Clark was equally well known for his own particular interviewing style.
Well, I shudder to think how many cigarettes one would have to smoke to use all these matches.
Jimison Clark was a sort of jack of all trades.
Well, Chief Inspector, these are the most unusual police patrol cars I've ever seen. They look almost like little dinky models. Why are they so small?
They're designed for a special purpose. The narrow, twisting roads on Loch Lomond side, Loch Long side, and the Gairloch. You've driven those roads yourself, and you must be aware that a large car is very cumbersome.
He would get his interviewee in front of him, and he would say, "I'll ask you this, and you say that. And then I'll ask you this, and you say that." It was a style that worked. It was couthy, but it was just part of the overall attraction of the programme.
And how do you operate when you get a call, say, in a sudden emergency?
That's been laid on for you as well, Mr. Clark. You'll hear one just now. A call coming in just now from the control room, giving the driver instructions to attend an incident.
We tried to make it as simple, light-hearted as possible. We used any idea that we thought would be workable. We were willing to take ideas from here, there and everywhere.
This fashion show, held in a studio using BBC staff as models, was the kind of quirky idea that A Quick Look Round became known for. But by 1967, the slow, gentle pace of the programme was beginning to stand out, and not for the right reasons.
It was dithering and wandering and babbling and silly.
Alistair Milne was appointed controller of BBC Scotland in January 1968. Having worked in a variety of current affairs programmes, his background meant he honed in immediately on Scotland's news output, with plans to shake it up.
I'd spent 3 months in America on a State Department scholarship before, and I'd seen what the Americans did, and there was a Huntley-Brinkley show, which was the nightly news on NBC. Chet Huntley was in New York, Dave Brinkley was in Washington, and they swapped stories between the two of them.
Chet Huntley, NBC News, New York.
And David Brinkley, NBC News, Washington.
And I thought, actually, this is a model for us because we've got studios in Glasgow and in Edinburgh and also in Aberdeen too. So that's what we set about. And I sent for Jim Kemp, who was in charge at the time, and said to him, we're going to start in April and we're going to call it Reporting Scotland.
The format changed completely. The whole thing had much greater pace, and it was much more to do with hard news stories, which of course it hadn't been before. Lots of new people came in. One or two of the relics, of which I was one of a quick look round, stayed. But on the whole, a whole new tidal wave of mostly journalists came in.
And those journalists were determined to make television news the sort of happening, of the moment, know it before anyone else does kind of news that BBC Scotland had never quite managed before.
There was a folk memory in the BBC at the time of the news department having carried what was in the newspapers that morning. And that was awfully difficult to eradicate, but we did eventually.
What was a great day was the following morning when you read the story that you'd covered the day before in the newspapers, because that was a real bit of role reversal over the years when it was always the newspapers that had the story and television that was following up. Oh dear, what a slow process television was.
Take one, end board.
When I started with the BBC, the technical people had the whip hand.
They didn't want to do news. They were BBC people, and they'd done schools programmes, they'd done drama, they'd done goodness knows what, and it's all at a fairly leisurely pace. And you've got those newsmen that come in and say, news, hurry, hurry, hurry. Never mind lunch, we'll get lunch later. But no, they had to stop for lunch. And they didn't like working for news. And it was an inconvenience, and there was a lot of friction between the BBC staff people and the newsmen.
Folk in the BBC were stuck in their ways in many cases, but nevertheless they gradually saw a logic of what we're doing. It was the done thing to respond to the newsroom, to throw everything in to what the news demanded.
With reporters and crews beginning to work together to meet deadlines, Reporting Scotland stood a better chance of becoming the programme it aspired to be. And in 1968, when a serial killer came to Glasgow, it was their first opportunity to cover a murder hunt on a massive scale.
It is thought that his Christian name may be John. He may speak of being of a family of two, his sister and himself, of having had a strict upbringing with a severe parental attitude towards drink. And he may speak of a strict religious upbringing and make reference to the Bible.
Bible John was one of the biggest murder hunts in Scotland at the time. But when the police are struggling, all media, I mean newspapers, radio and television, do their best to assist the police in an inquiry, and that's only right and proper.
We have now assembled an artist's impression, and any person who sees this artist's impression in the press or on television and who feels that they can usefully assist the police in identifying this man is urged to come forward forthwith with any information that they may have.
Mr. Dalgleish, this is the first time an artist's impression has been used in Scotland.
I understand that.
Oh, Mr. Binney, was the artist a policeman?
No, the artist was the deputy head of the Glasgow School of Art, a Mr. Lennox Patterson.
Nobody knows how accurate that was, but if it was in the least bit inaccurate, everyone was looking elsewhere. They were looking for the wrong man.
Marine murder room, BT.
Whether accurate or not, the artist impression is still in use because the case remains unsolved. At the time, it was one of the biggest murder stories to hit Scotland. But it centred in Glasgow, and the newsroom had the whole of the country to cover.
The news agendas between the north of Scotland and the Central Belt tended to be quite different. The Glasgow news agenda tended to be quite a lot of crime, but then in Aberdeen in winter, it was the weather, it was the snow, it was fishing boats in trouble, it was people doing silly things up mountains. And so Glasgow was always interested in what Aberdeen had to offer because there were stories of a different shade and a different hue. They brought something very different to the programme.
The studio in Aberdeen had been in operation since 1962, and one story in particular had been keeping them pretty busy.
The Royals.
The Queen arriving in Aberdeen, the Queen departing from Aberdeen.
Getting off the flight at Aberdeen Airport. Getting onto the flight at Aberdeen Airport.
Queen coming off the train at Ballater on her way to Balmoral.
The Queen at Crathy Church. The Queen at the Braemar Highland Games.
There's a mouse about this house.
It wasn't the most challenging of journalistic tasks as I remember it.
It was a story that would, of course, run and run. But with its new format, the demands of reporting Scotland on the team in Aberdeen increased.
What I hadn't really appreciated was the size of the area that I was expected to cover. An area that somebody told me represented a fifth of the land mass of Great Britain. Access to story was one of the big problems. Took hours to get there, sometimes, and hours to get back.
When disaster struck off the coast of Orkney on the 17th of March 1969, the story was over 200 miles away and across a tempestuous sea, but it needed to be told nevertheless. The Long Hope lifeboat from the island of Hoy had tried to force its way through huge seas to rescue the crew of a cargo ship. By the evening, radio contact with the lifeboat had been lost, and the following day there had been no word, but local boats were still out looking.
The job had to be done. We had to mobilise the facilities that we had and get a man up there, and that happened to be the reporter that we had at the time, Ron Neal.
We chartered an aircraft, flew up to Kirkwall, and then got a boat, a very small fishing boat, and the cameraman and the sound recorders and myself in this storm in this tiny fishing boat crossed over Scapa Flow. We were pretty ill by the time we got to the other side. But immediately we had to start filming because within a few hours we had to film the local people who were prepared to talk about it, go and see film the empty lifeboat station, that kind of thing, but then get back on the same little fishing boat a couple of hours later and go through the same Scapa Flow, up and down, and then fly back on the chartered plane. As we were flying over the Pentland Firth, we heard on the aircraft radio that something large and white had been spotted 10 miles away. And so we diverted the aircraft and flew over what was the upturned hull of the Long Hope lifeboat with, of course, 7 of the crew sadly inside her. And that obviously was the film that led the news. It kind of sunk into me that 2/3 of the male population of this island had been wiped, or a part of this island had been wiped out. And yet the first thing they were asking for was a new lifeboat. And so I became interested in the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, and I've actually worked for the lifeboats ever since because I just felt that I wanted to give something to that I think amazing organisation as a result of witnessing the impact of the disaster, but yet the desire to carry on the tradition.
Filming reports in far-off places was all part and parcel of working from the Aberdeen newsroom. But with the bigger stories, there was often an added pressure when both London and Glasgow were vying for pictures.
I had to try and serve really two masters, London being one and Glasgow the other. I tried to do both, but it wasn't always possible. The one instance that caused me some anguish was concerning another lifeboat disaster, Fraserburgh lifeboat, where I gave London the picture at 6 o'clock because it was available. It was a still picture, highly dramatic, of the lifeboat's last moments. And then to try and serve Glasgow. But of course, there wasn't much time to do anything different for Glasgow. And at the end, I came out of the studio and there were two phone calls. One from London saying, great, we'll talk about 9 o'clock news later. And the other one was from Glasgow saying, what the hell are you playing at?
Overall, the relationship between BBC News in Scotland and BBC News in London wasn't great. In fact, at times it was pretty poor.
Relations with London were strained almost to breaking point when just over 2 years after its launch, Reporting Scotland faced its biggest story to date, the worst football disaster ever to have happened in Europe. On the 2nd of January 1971, the Old Firm match between Rangers and Celtic at Ibrox ended in terrible tragedy when 66 people were crushed as they tried to leave the stadium.
It was a dreadful night. The whole city went into mourning, if not the whole country.
And this to have hit our city today is, to me, words fail me. And to go over there and see the tragedy of this and the sight of these poor people who were out for a good day's sport and, as I say, the festival of football, and to realise that tonight there are so many sad homes in Glasgow.
It was a big story, undoubtedly, and a tragedy for the families. But it was just another story. And you've got to be quite dispassionate about those things, because if you become too emotional, you're not doing the viewer any real service there. So it was another big story. And as sometimes happened on big stories in Scotland, somebody in London gets the bright idea, hey, we'd better get our own man up there.
Is there going to be an official public inquiry?
There must be. There must be.
It really angered me that suddenly you've got a big story and London feels it cannot be handled in Scotland, and they've got to send one of their own people up. And the next day, or perhaps the day after that, I mean, I do an interview with the then Lord Provost.
I understand, apart from the larger sums, that you've ordered a small collection box to be put in the front of the city chambers today.
Yes, after all, 2 bob to somebody might well be the equivalent of your 10 or 15 pounds.
And I conclude my interview, and he and his camera crew from London keep the Lord Provost sitting there, set their camera up, their lights, their sound, and they do pretty much the same interview.
Lord Provost, what sort of donations are you getting at present?
At the end of the day, I didn't see quite what the benefit was of sending someone up from London, but there we were. We all used to get quite angry about that.
The only difference between the two reports was, of course, the fact that the London one was shot in colour, but this was quite usual for the time.
The BBC was what we call piebald, whereas some of it was in colour and some of it was in black and white, and some parts of the BBC were colourised before others.
What programmes benefit most by being in colour?
I think I would almost turn that round the other way and say which programmes don't improve. I shall be very interested to see what happens with news, because we shall have to go from colour to black and white and back again, because not every bit of film that is shot in colour. So that I'm a little doubtful about news, but I think it'll be quite exciting.
And until final decisions were made at the top about the pace of change, Scotland just had to wait and wait for colour.
We did have the fag end of facilities in some things.
And you did feel like a poor cousin. But there was an understanding that it couldn't all happen at once.
And I remember when a particularly bad winter, BBC Two wanted film of this, and he says, you'll have colour. And I said, no, it'll be black and white. Oh, I said, well, but that shouldn't bother you, because snow is white, whether it's in colour or black and white. And he said, oh, yes. So we just had to take our place in the queue.
Is this a television camera?
For the BBC.
Most of the studios were converted by 1975, and just in time. The world was about to turn its attention to a major story breaking in Scotland, and it wouldn't have done to be behind the times.
Okay, here we go. We have crash lap now.
North Sea Oil was the biggest industrial story to hit Scotland in living memory.
Oil was a story of international significance, but with the relationship between London and Scotland still a little rocky, to say the least, something had to be done, and the decision was taken to employ a correspondent to work for both newsrooms.
The drilling rigs and ships in the North Sea have been striking oil at an unprecedented rate. There are still several £1,000 million worth of orders to be won, and the competition for them is fierce. I, at the time, was actually quite a young industrial correspondent in London, doing an endless round of strikes and labour disputes. We're talking about the early 70s, which I didn't really like very much. So I got onto the idea that this oil business was, you know, this is real insight, this. You know, North Sea Oil was rather a good story. A, they weren't on strike. B, you could get out and about and see fantastic pictures for television, and a fantastic, positive economic story rather than all the negative stuff that was going on. Just at that time, the BBC was enveloped in its usual political row between Glasgow and London. So they appointed a new controller for BBC Scotland, a really significant figure on the national stage, Alistair Hetherington, who had been an extremely long-serving and successful editor of The Guardian, and a Scot to boot, to be the controller of BBC Scotland. One of his conditions was that he'd have a kind of network correspondent, work for BBC Scotland on the one side, and then national, shouldn't say that, should I? Network BBC on the other, a kind of hybrid sort of figure, but based in Scotland.
Michael did not bring with him the imperial attitude that you know, that some of his colleagues did, but what if he did? It was you know, bashed out of him pretty quickly.
BBC Scotland had a reputation for being an incompetent load of vipers, and impossible to work with, chippy beyond even the average Scottish chippiness about the English and about London. So it was with considerable surprise that I found these people were actually really quite nice, at least to my face. I wasn't quite clear about what was happening behind my back.
Michael Burke was a first-class reporter. He could envisage a story, he could see it all in film before he ever went out of the office, and he could give instruction in discussion with his cameraman exactly what he wanted, so that when he came back, the amount of film he had to discard was really minimal.
The main question now is how much that swing has been due to a genuine upsurge of nationalist feeling, as opposed to protest voting against the major parties. It's a question the referendum may well now answer.
What a rubbish.
Why don't you... 4, take 5.
By the late 70s, Reporting Scotland's credibility as a news programme was on the increase, but not just because of the way it handled breaking news, but the way it was also digging deeper into some of the more intriguing stories.
The hunt for the 82-year-old former MP and his wife began after police discovered the body of a man in the boot of a car parked outside the Blenheim House Hotel at North Berwick on Monday night. This was the third body to be found in what is now Scotland's largest murder inquiry for 20 years. The man found in the boot of a car at North Berwick on Monday was Donald Hall, who had been released from prison in Cumbria only last Friday.
My role was to be a news reporter, that's what it was. Later it developed into doing investigations.
We had to have reporters who were virtually off the roster, doing nothing else but investigative journalism.
What was it then that made you at first suspicious about his credentials?
Because he couldn't serve properly, like my old butler, that I understood he had no experience.
What sort of things did he do wrong that a proper butler might not do?
Yes, he put the water jug on the table.
One of David Scott's most successful investigations was into the murders committed by sometime butler and villain Archibald Hall, who had killed his most recent employers, their housekeeper, and his own brother, then dumped the bodies in Scotland before getting caught.
We managed to get Archibald Hall confessing to all 5 murders, and in great detail, and on tape. That's on a sound tape.
We spent the entire Christmas period in a very nice hotel with friends, none of them guessing that we had now committed a number of murders. You thought of how quickly things that had started had caught up with you. I wondered, when was it going to stop?
And that had quite an effect on many of the people whose relatives had been murdered, because I spoke to them all, and they were quite keen to get what they now call closure on the matter, and to learn what had happened to their relatives and to their loved ones. But even now, it would be impossible for me to tell you how that came about and who was involved.
Hall and Keto will now be taken to London, and there they'll be charged with the murders of Mrs. Dorothy Scott Elliott, Mary Coggle and Donald Hall. Police believe that Mrs. Scott Elliott died in her London flat, and that Donald Hall and Mary Coggle were killed in the rented cottage near Carlisle. It's expected their trial on these charges will be heard in the Old Bailey sometime this summer.
By the end of the 70s, viewers expected their national news to cover all aspects of contemporary Scotland. But with so much happening, plus additional bulletins at breakfast time and lunch, there just wasn't enough people to do the job. So in the early 80s, a band of ambitious young starter journalists were recruited to join more experienced staff.
It was quite intimidating, actually. I found it quite intimidating, and I'm, believe it or not, quite shy. So I found it quite scary. There was a lot of shouting. There was a lot of men sort of stomping and shouting very loudly.
Even more intimidating was the fact that everyone knew what they were doing. They were professionals. There was an atmosphere of strict professionalism. People were ticked off if they didn't get it right, and their grammar was checked, and the construction of their stories was checked. And I, of course, knew nothing about this and just sat looking slightly ill at ease, probably, in the corner.
To be honest with you, you were just watching people and seeing what they do and seeing, you know, these are fantastic reporters. You know, like Paddy Christie was there at that time. Brilliant reporter. Mary Marquis. What can I tell you? I mean, Mary Marquis, the Joan Collins of BBC Scotland. Absolutely fantastic, never put a foot wrong, utterly serene and absolutely brilliant. I don't think I've ever really wanted to be in front of camera, but I do remember they used to send me out to do Vox Pops because they said, oh, she can talk to anybody. And after doing sort of, you know, little bits and pieces, I thought, yo, I really want to do this. It's going to be fantastic. And I got called in by the big boss, George Sinclair. And I thought, this is it. He's going to offer me a job. I was so excited. And I went in and I sat down. He just looked at me. He used to sort of look at you, put his glasses down, sort of look at you like this. And he said, he just kind of went, he said, no, never going to make it in television. He said, your accent, it's offensive. You'll have to go to elocution lessons. And I sort of looked at him and I absolutely crestfallen.
She was terribly Glasgow. She was really, really Glasgow. You think she's Glasgow now, she's not a patch in what she was.
At that time, nobody spoke like me. Nobody spoke like that. You either spoke in a sort of pseudo-English accent or very posh Edinburgh, kind of the same thing. So nobody really spoke the way that I did. But he did me the best favour ever. It was the best possible thing that could have happened. Very sad to leave BBC Scotland because I loved it, but wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now if it hadn't been for his brutal honesty.
Lorraine got her big break as a reporter at TV AM without having to change her accent and never looked back. But meanwhile, the Reporting Scotland staff were having to adjust to an entirely new way of working.
We started, I think, to phase film out around about 1983-84, and what was called PSC, portable single cameras, came in, and these were effectively video cameras.
It was much more immediate. You could cover stories right up to the last minute. Not quite live, but as
almost live. It put more pressure on you as a news reporter to be much more quick thinking. You were having to do stuff immediately rather than having 5 minutes or even better, an hour to think about it.
Things became a lot easier then because you could edit simply by dubbing images from one tape onto the next and building up your story in that way. And it did mean that you could use pieces over and over again. You could have the same shot as a headline as you had in the main story.
Good evening. Mrs. Thatcher is back in Scotland for the second time in a week. The Prime Minister will attend the opening of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland.
But video couldn't solve all the problems. It was still impossible to get pictures from some stories, no matter how fast the technology had become.
I hope that on the line now is our reporter Jane Frankie from Aberdeen. Jane, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Donald, I can. Details are still very sketchy, but according to the Coast Guard, the explosion happened about an hour and a half ago on the Piper Alpha platform. According to the RAF, an emergency evacuation of the platform has been requested by the operators with a view to abandoning the platform altogether.
The Piper Alpha was a North Sea oil production platform which accounted for around 10% of the oil and gas production from the North Sea. A leakage of gas which had built up beneath the platform ignited, causing a massive explosion.
The big issue with the Piper Alpha story was that the actual incident was hundreds of miles off into the North Sea, and we couldn't get there and we couldn't see what happened. And we really didn't start to respond to it until the following day. So it was a very difficult story to cover because there wasn't really a focus. We couldn't get to the scene of the incident.
That was why, I mean, it sounds ghoulish that there I was with a camera based at the hospital. Waiting for what? Well, clearly casualties. But they were the only people we were going to get information from. There's a helipad at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, and we knew that casualties would be brought into the helipad by helicopter. And I remember thinking how few helicopters came in. The vision that sticks in my head still is the sight of those helicopters coming in that sort of semi-light, and how few there were, and the dazed look on those who were walking, and the stretchers, and how few there were. I mean, I knew there must be at least 200 people on that platform, and I only counted in, from memory, 6 helicopters that night.
Our reporter in Aberdeen, Jane Frankie, has been to the hospital, and possibly we can link up with Jane now. Jane, good morning. Are you there?
Good morning. Yes, I am.
A distressing scene at the hospital. What is the latest from there?
Well, it really hasn't changed much. The situation hasn't changed much. There have been 7 helicopters in now who've brought in 27 men. 16 of them have been detained and 1 is serious. And there's also an unconfirmed report that a ship is on its way in with 20 men on board, but I must stress that that is an unconfirmed report.
The story was developing all the time, you see, because the death toll was climbing all the time. There were attempts to put out the fire on the platform, which failed. There were rescue things going on all the time around the area. So it wasn't as if, you know, the story came to an end on day 2. It didn't.
Military rescue services, including NATO vessels, are searching an area of almost 300 square miles around the shell of the Piper Alpha platform. Forces personnel were at the scene just over an hour after the alarm was raised.
Okay, that's fine.
This was a story that mattered to the world. The platform was owned by an American company, the crew came from near and far, and any country with oil anywhere near them wanted to know what was happening. Television, newspaper and radio journalists from around the world arrived en masse in a way that Scotland had never encountered before.
I know that there were grave concerns from some of the bereaved families, some of the survivors, about the level of competition between the various media. My city, in a way, turned against the media. And I'm using the media in its widest sense because of the behaviour of some of it.
When it comes to these big national tragedies, I think when you're working on reporting Scotland, you do treat them differently than maybe people who are coming from elsewhere to cover the story, because the people who are involved are our viewers, and the people who may have died are our viewers, and the communities that are affected are people who watch Reporting Scotland.
We were enormously lucky to have Jane Frankie and Sandy Chisholm, who were rooted in the community, who understood the community, who the community felt understood them. And their reports had an extra resonance. They were believed, because obviously they're accurate, but the audience having sensed that these were people who were not unaffected by the tragedy. Always professional, but not distant, not remote, but firmly engaged in what the community was going through.
When the world's media did eventually pack up and leave, no one anticipated that they would all be back within 5 short months. But that's exactly what happened when a 747 Pan Am Flight 103, travelling from London to New York, came down over Lockerbie in southwest Scotland.
It was the night of December the 21st, 1988, when the newsroom party was in full swing.
Everybody was in sort of holiday mode, including the Glasgow newsroom. Perhaps we were in danger of being taken off guard.
People had, been drinking, laughing, dancing and so forth, and then the call came in.
And somebody came up from the newsroom and told us that a jet had crashed into a petrol station in Lockerbie. And we actually didn't believe the person initially.
According to her, it was a 747. So that can't be the case. It's a jumbo jet. That's a 747. And she said, that's what they said.
We drove very quickly down to Lockerbie, and we got there probably an hour and a half after the plane had crashed. And what we encountered was a scene of incredible shock and devastation.
I remember driving along this main street, and it was sort of quite a clear night. And you could see all this rubble and debris lying around. It was strange, nobody around, totally deserted. You didn't know quite what you were going into. You knew something terrible had happened.
I think what then happened over the next 24 hours is something that no journalist who covered it would ever forget. People seek information, people want to know, people want to understand why. And that's what essentially we do as news broadcasters.
One of the problems was, of course, the communications. Nowadays, people open a suitcase and there's a satellite there. Even in Lockerbie time, we had to use radio links.
We're having a little trouble with the quality of our picture, Kirsty, but let's carry on as best we can. Give us some indication of the extent of the devastation.
The devastation is spread over a large area. What you can see in every street is debris, small parts of fuselage, a lot of rubbish and rubble that has come from both windows that have been blown out and buildings that have been damaged.
During the night, we got all this stuff together, and from then on, it was virtually non-stop.
Everybody was working together. It didn't matter that I was working at breakfast time, somebody else was working on the lunchtime news, somebody else was working the 6 o'clock news. You were helping them as much as possible. And that's when I just think the BBC is a great organisation. When it comes together like that and helps each other, it is then, in that kind of cliche, it is then one BBC. Because, we have the ability and we have the people to really cope with that kind of story.
It has been established that 2 parts of the metal luggage pallets framework show conclusive evidence of a detonating high explosive.
The confirmation that there was a bomb on board Flight PA-103 has turned this into a worldwide criminal investigation.
As with Piper Alpha, journalists from all over the world arrived in the small town of Lockerbie extremely quickly and in huge numbers.
People appearing from all over the world, from Australia and Japanese and all this, and they all had their own little 15-minute slots. They had to do this, and if we weren't finished, they were pushing you out the way and so on. And one stage I had to go down and sort of calm them down a bit. You know, it's not your turn yet.
I actually think, I might be wrong in this, but I actually think it got to the situation where the number of journalists and camera teams were greater than the number of residents in Lockerbie.
But lessons had been learned from the Piper Alpha disaster about the effect of the media circus on a local community, and BBC Scotland were determined not to let the pack mentality leave such a sour taste this time.
We helped them to train up people who would act as their spokespeople, and they were in a far better position to deal with the media when it descended on the first anniversary. We were going to be working and dealing with these people for a very long time, and we had to keep good relationships, and that's what we did.
Helping communities deal with the media was undoubtedly a good thing, but this was the dawn of the age of spin, and there were those who were learning how to manipulate rather than manage.
There were no Alistair Campbells in those days, but there were people who made an attempt to pressurise BBC Scotland.
Poll tax system will reveal to the electorate
We'd put in a bid for an interview with Mrs Thatcher at the height of her prime ministerial powers, when the poll tax was the big issue. And they'd come back to us saying, yes, Mrs Thatcher was going to be in Scotland and would do an interview with BBC Scotland. And I was asked who the interviewer would be. And I said, Kirsty Wark. And there was a silence at the other end, and the person said, couldn't someone else do it? Couldn't a man do it? Mrs Thatcher prefers to be interviewed by a man. And I said, no, I'm sorry. The response was that, well, perhaps they would offer the interview to STV, our great rivals. And they were told very firmly, well, if that's what you want to do, fair enough, but you get a better audience on BBC Scotland.
BBC Scotland absolutely stuck to their guns, no question. Prime Minister, you've always said that you didn't enter politics in order to be popular. But why are you so unpopular in Scotland?
Well, I don't think I'm necessarily the right person to answer that, but I wouldn't entirely say it was true. I regard it as a very great honour to be Prime Minister of Scotland.
When we started the interview, I realised that she'd worked out a strategy, well, a strategy had been worked out for, and that strategy was to keep saying, we in Scotland.
And the increases you have this year, the increases we have this year in Scotland, are very much less than when the charge came in.
I thought this is kind of bizarre. We in Scotland do this, we in Scotland do this, as if overcompensating for the fact that she knew that she wasn't very popular in Scotland, which kind of made it worse. Your own backbenchers are saying that the community charge is a political cyanide pill and it will cause deep hatred and division. Now, these are your own backbenchers.
I have never heard the expression you have used before.
Tony Marlow and Hugh Dykes, respectively.
It was a very fair, very robust interview. And there was a lot of press comment about it afterwards. It made Kirsty's career, I think.
Prime Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
But there was no pleasantries afterwards from Mrs Thatcher.
By the 90s, Reporting Scotland had established itself as a fully developed news operation, up to speed and up to the minute, and more than ready for the latest technology, taking television journalism into a whole new era.
Suddenly, you could go somewhere with a satellite dish and broadcast live from there. More live input into the programme is great, and it's great from a presenter's point of view because it means we can get news of a story that's breaking perhaps just as we go on air, and if geography permits, then we can have a vehicle there, we can have all the technical governments up and running during the programme. So often you are faced with, we have made contact with the reporter, we can talk to them, go.
Colin, have there been any developments?
Sorry, Jackie, you're breaking up there. I can't hear you, Jackie. All I can say is that the talks are still going on. They've been going on for 3.5 hours now, so it is looking promising.
Colin McKinnon, thank you.
Sometimes the technology lets us down. They often say we can get pictures back from the moon, but sometimes we've had our moments when we can't get pictures back from Mary Hill, which is a 9-iron up the road. But as a presenter, I always say, you're not paid for what you do,
because my children are always laughing that my job is reading out loud. You're paid for what you can do. So when everything is falling about around your ears, it is your job to do the old swan thing and make the viewer think that everything is completely under control.
And now we go back to Washington and to Arlington Cemetery for the arrival of President Clinton.
Good evening from Arlington Cemetery, the final resting place for America's heroes.
We had gone live at the start of the programme for the unveiling of a Lockerbie Memorial, which was a very, very big event, and it was happening just in the grounds of the White House. Sadly, the president then, Bill Clinton, was running late. They came back to us with 15 minutes to go, so we're filling.
As you can hear in the background, there is a very Scottish feel. I think that's Westering home. Now, we will be back with the arrival of President Clinton, but for now, back to you, Sally, in the studio.
Obviously, we'd pre-trailed this hugely, so everyone in Scotland knew that this was happening and that we were not going to interview the president, but we were going to have footage of it.
Welcome back to Arlington Cemetery, where the President of the United States has just arrived. He has arrived in his motorcade. I hope that we can see him. At the moment...
With 20 seconds to go, I was able to say, yes, the car is just coming. Yes, Bill Clinton, the President of the United States, is just arriving. Thank you very much. From Reporting Scotland, good night.
And we can see the President arriving now.
We got pelters. It was the front page of the Herald the next day. And you know who got the blame? Me.
It was tempting to overuse the live capability at occasions that didn't necessarily warrant the immediacy. But where it did matter a great deal was when speed was of the essence, when getting information out and keeping it up to the minute was important to everyone.
This is BBC One. There's a change to our schedule now. Your regional programme follows in 15 minutes. Now, in light of today's tragic events, we join viewers in Scotland for Reporting Scotland.
Good evening. Here in Dunblane, a scene of hell and damnation is how a teacher described a primary school gym hall minutes after 16 children aged 5 and 6 and their teacher were murdered.
I think the reporting of Dunblane was quite significant because it was the first time that a huge story of international significance had happened in Scotland at a time when we were able to cover it live.
Well, a press conference about the events today has just ended. Maurice Smith, you were there. What is the latest?
What we've heard so far is some confirmation about the Thomas Hamilton, the gunman. He's a local unemployed man, a member of a local gun club. His body was indeed found, as we suspected earlier, in the school.
We knew the enormity of what had happened, and we knew that all of Scotland, and as it turned out, all of the UK, were tuned into our output because Network decided to take the first 15 minutes of Reporting Scotland throughout the UK, and that had never happened before.
Alan Mackay, you were one of the first reporters at the scene. You're also a local man. What effect has this had on you?
Well, I think what we have to face up to now is that forevermore Dunblane's going to be coupled with Hungerford as a place where a mass murderer went about his business. I think, though, that this town, or Cathedral City as it's properly known, will rise to that challenge. Now, I know you could say that about any community in Scotland, but I genuinely think that will happen. I mean, I know this town, I live here, I know the people involved. I know the head teacher because our little boy is at the school. But I think talking to local people, to some of my friends today, it's the human cost that is going to get to everyone.
The people of Dunblane were so wounded by it and horrified by it that it was clear great sensitivity would have to be taken in the coverage. And unusually, London decided that they would ask me to guide London producers to make sure that we in Scotland were comfortable with what they were proposing to broadcast. And that hadn't happened before.
Well, I'm joined now from Dunblane by our correspondent, Alan Mackay. Alan, have you been able to get any sense of how the people of Dunblane are reacting to what's happened?
I got a sense of that even before I'd seen the school. I parked my car and walked about 100 yards to where the school stands on a main road through the town of Dunblane. And even before I saw any of the parents who were anguished over their loss, I heard their wailing. It was one of the most dramatic moments that I've ever witnessed in 15 years of television journalism, and it was really quite horrifying.
By Friday, the community were begging the media to leave. And after reporting Scotland, I said to colleagues, I don't want to be at the funerals on Monday. I think we should withdraw.
The time had come for us to pull our journalists out of Dunblane, and the rest of the media quite quickly concurred with that, and that's what we did.
That was a good decision. The whole of the media agreed to respect the parents' wishes.
And I think that's unprecedented, certainly in any major national tragedy that I've ever covered.
The media, including the BBC, are respecting the parents' wishes that the funeral should be held in private.
Reporting Scotland came of age through the experience of covering 3 horrific tragedies within the space of 8 short years. But there was no time to rest and reflect. The campaign for devolution, which had kept political reporters busy for nearly 30 years, was about to bear fruit. In 1997, Labour set about fulfilling their manifesto promise of a Scottish Parliament, and for many, the BBC's national regional news output would no longer be enough.
Politicians from right across this political spectrum in Scotland, from Michael Forsyth at one extreme to Alex Salmond at the other extreme, have said that 6 o'clock news from Scotland is essential to improve the quality of democratic debate in Scotland. Now, that is a consensus in Scotland which is simply not registered in London.
There was a political campaign suggesting that we should no longer have 6 o'clock news from London, that instead BBC Scotland should do a news programme which combined international, UK and Scottish news into the one programme.
Ken Cargill said the case would be compelling after the elections for the Scottish Parliament next May. And 8 presenters from BBC Scotland have written to newspapers backing the campaign for national and international news from Glasgow.
This provoked a big debate, obviously. And many people were against it, and many people were worried about it.
The opponents of such a move characterised it as the Scottish Six.
People feared that it would be Reporting Scotland with a few national and international stories tacked onto it.
Politicians and commentators talked about the idea that you were suddenly going to hear about some sheep escaping from a field in Auchtermuchty. Well, of course, whatever you think about the 6 o'clock news from Scotland, it wasn't going to be about that. And a much more accurate way of describing it would have been to say the 6 o'clock news anchored in Scotland, but covering stories from as far apart as, the Lebanon and Limerick.
And eventually it was decided that the Board of Governors was not minded to introduce it. And it was kept under review and then kicked into touch. Sometime after devolution, actually produced the Scottish Parliament.
Instead, BBC Scotland were given an additional slot midway through Newsnight. But that wasn't to be quite the end of the Scottish Six. 8 years later, and with a new First Minister, the idea has been dug up again and dusted off as part of a wider criticism of the BBC's investment in Scotland.
The debate is beginning again, but it's much more complex this time. And it's not just because there's been a significant political change in Scotland. The debate now is complex because of the way that people consume their news in a very, very different way. And the way that we cover the news has never stood still.
OK, this is what we're going to do. We're going to run the laser, we're going to mix to 2, we're going to cut to TX Lockerbie, we're going to then run a clip off the back of that. The out was, yes, they are. And
Reval, just a reminder, we're cutting you up in a live shot at the top.
Well, that's it. There'll be an update just before 7.
OK, stand by.
Join the BBC News teams where you are.
Run titles.
In 2007, Reporting Scotland faces a whole new future.
Good evening. You're watching Reporting Scotland.
On the programme tonight,
Viewers with mobile phones are increasingly likely to be the first at the scene of any breaking story. And it's unlikely that anyone will sit down to watch the news at a specific time. And the news teams around Scotland will have to constantly adapt to keep up with the pace of change. But, as familiar as it all seems now, 50 years of television news from BBC Scotland is a mere drop in the ocean of history. And really, it's only the beginning.
And Reval.
We have always told a very interesting story about Scotland, and I think we will continue to do that. So, yes, we can celebrate 50 years, but we mustn't, and we're not going to rest on our laurels.
Next on BBC One Scotland, enjoy the landscape of Norfolk with songs of praise.